welcome to the debate. Our focus today lands on a really difficult topic, gun violence in the United States. The material we've looked at frames this not just as, a crime problem, but really as a kind of plague hitting families hard. And the data is, it's sobering. Gun violence is now the biggest killer of children in this country.
It's truly devastating. And the analysis we're drawing from suggests this catastrophe stems from a mix of things, what it calls a cultural problem, rooted in deeper systemic social failures, and also a gun problem, meaning the sheer prevalence of firearms.
Right, so the central question for us today is really about cause, and maybe more importantly about solutions. Which factor is the primary driver here? Is it the overwhelming number of guns, their accessibility, or is it the underlying socioeconomic conditions, the cultural failures that seem to breed trauma and crime? And critically, where should we be focusing our efforts for intervention?
A crucial question.
And my position is that the unique, almost extreme accessibility of firearms in the U.S. is a decisive factor. I think the statistical outcomes and the comparisons with other countries make that pretty clear. So for me, action has to start with controlling the lethal instrument itself.
And I'll be arguing the other side, that the deep-seated socioeconomic issues, poverty, unaddressed trauma, and frankly, our nation's failed reliance on just punitive, hammer-type responses, that these are the real root causes. If we want lasting change, meaningful change, we have to tackle the human misery at the core of this problem first.
Okay, so my position really comes down to the clarity you get when you look at the statistics, especially through comparison. If you analyze the US, the data shows this almost a 1-to-1 ratio. The murder rate tracks almost directly with the density of gun ownership. And that correlation is particularly stark in places with high gun density, like the South. Now, that correlation, to me, is a powerful signal that the tool itself is the accelerator of the violence. And to really underscore this point, I think we have to look beyond our own borders. I understand the emphasis on cultural sickness, I do. But that view struggles, I think, to explain the huge difference between the US and countries that demographically aren't that different culturally. Nations like the UK, Australia, New Zealand, these places share Western heritage, democratic traditions, and historically, maybe even a similar fondness for independence, maybe even tendencies towards violence. But their firearm homicide rates, they're minuscule compared to ours.
Okay.
So what's the difference? Well, the difference is accessibility and policy. These countries put in place really stringent controls. Often, citizens have to demonstrate a specific justifiable need to own a firearm. And the material points out this shift directly led to a drop in lethal outcomes. So this international evidence, for me, it proves that even if our culture has issues, controlling the easy availability of the most lethal tools is the most immediate and probably the most effective lever we have to pull to save lives right now.
That's certainly a compelling case when you focus on those immediate statistical outcomes. But I'd argue that correlation, while highlighting the severity of the illness, doesn't really get to its origin, does it? Focusing so heavily on the gun itself, it kind of ignores the mechanisms of learned criminal behavior. And those, as the material explores quite carefully, are driven by this whole nexus of devastating social factors. Look, crime is almost never about just one thing. It's often the result of poverty, the crushing weight of economic hardship that pushes people towards crime just to survive. It's fueled by substance abuse, where, the need to fund an addiction leads to desperate, erratic acts. And maybe most crucially, it's rooted in these profound psychological and family factors, pervasive childhood trauma, violence being normalized in certain environments, antisocial traits maybe, and mental health challenges that just go chronically untreated in so many communities.
Right.
And these elements, they compound. They create these tragic environments. You see them in pockets of severe poverty in inner cities, but also in deeply marginalized, very poor rural areas. It creates what the material quite accurately calls a perfect door for crime. Now, what I think distinguishes the US context is our kind of political preference to ignore these structural failures. Instead, we rely on what I call the punitive hammer approach: mass incarceration, mandatory minimums, hyper-militarized policing. This approach, focusing on punishment, not rehabilitation or prevention, it just fuels the cycle. It doesn't solve the root problem, it just manages symptoms by, frankly, creating more human misery, more recidivism, and deeper mistrust between communities and authorities. We can't really stop the violence until we stop creating the conditions that make violence seem like the only viable option for some people.
Okay, I understand the focus on social justice, on structural neglect, absolutely, but the argument that the U.S.'s cultural failures are somehow uniquely intractable compared to similar countries, that doesn't quite hold up for me when lives are being lost at this staggering rate. Right now, you acknowledge the success of places like Australia, which, let's remember, had a pretty similar rugged, pro-gun kind of mindset before their reforms.
True.
So if they, with similar cultural traits, manage to dramatically reduce violence by controlling the tool, why must we insist on waiting, potentially for generations, for some massive shift in socioeconomic policy that might or might not happen? The truth is, while yes, socioeconomic conditions can drive criminal impulse, the gun determines the lethality of that impulse. We're debating a statistical outcome here: massive death rates. You know, the material Stewart uses this analogy. If militarism is sometimes seen as necessary to keep world peace, but it's diplomacy that brings peace, then widespread guns in society are like a domestic form of militarism. They might disguise the underlying problems, yes, I grant you that, but they absolutely accelerate the tragedy. Controlling the weapon in this analogy is like disarming the militarism so that diplomacy, the deeper social work, even has a chance. We are losing children now. Immediate control of the tool feels like the most ethical, immediate intervention we have.
Well, I'm not convinced you're fully grappling with the sheer depth of the societal decay here, which I believe makes the US situation uniquely volatile. When I look at Australia or New Zealand, yes, they share heritage, but they also possess fundamentally stronger social commitments. I mean, robust social safety nets, universal health care, substantially less income inequality. That drastically reduces the kind of pressure cooker environment we see in many parts of the US. And here, that resulting lack of social capital, it translates directly into a lack of respect for authority. Why? Because for many communities, that authority has systemically failed them over and over. So the gun prevalence isn't just some statistical anomaly. It's a symptom, a manifestation of a profound cultural sickness where fear and distrust run so deep that people feel the need to arm themselves against each other, sometimes even against the state. If we just use gun control as the primary fix, it feels like we're treating a massive festering wound by just, tying off the limb. We might stop the bleeding temporarily, save the immediate life perhaps, but the systemic infection, it's still there. The US politically prefers to ignore that festering poverty and exclusion. So to simply remove the gun and declare victory, that seems to ignore the moral imperative to actually heal the systemic causes of the trauma in the first place.
Let's drill down again into that statistical reality, though. That near one-to-one ratio between gun density and the murder rate. You suggest correlation isn't causation, and okay, that's a fair methodological point in general. But in public health, when you see such a powerful, consistent statistical relationship like this one, you have to prioritize removing the instrumentality that's facilitating the catastrophe. But
think about the mechanism, right? A firearm turns what might be a momentary lapse, a heated argument, a sudden spike of suicidal despair, even a petty dispute between neighbors, into a permanent, irreversible tragedy. A gun doesn't just enable death, it provides incredible speed and scalability. The material mentions the Minnesota church shooting as one example. Lethal availability means a disturbed, desperate person can get their hands on a weapon capable of killing dozens in mere moments. When firearms are just everywhere, the threshold for lethal escalation drops almost to nothing. So focusing on removing the most lethal variable seems like the most direct way to reduce the probability of mass catastrophe, regardless of how long it takes to heal the deeper social wounds. That's an important distinction you make, the speed and lethality. I agree. However, I think you might be misinterpreting the direction of causality driving that 1-to-1 ratio. I would argue that guns tend to proliferate most heavily in communities already destabilized, already ravaged by those primary causes of crime we talked about. Generational poverty, addiction, systemic trauma, in environments where opportunity is scarce and fear is, well, paramount. The demand for self-protection, whether that threat is real or just perceived, it naturally soars.
So, if crime is fundamentally, as the material suggests, learned behavior stemming from deep trauma and lack of opportunity, then simply removing the gun, well, it might lead those disturbed people, those trapped in desperation, to just find another hammer, as the saying goes. They might resort to knives or vehicles or arson or blunt force trauma. Yes, okay, the mass casualty potential might be reduced, and that's not insignificant. But the underlying violence, the pain, the willingness to inflict harm, that remains untouched. The material itself makes this point quite directly. Guns don't fix problems, people fix problems. Doesn't that mean we must invest in the people, mental health support, education, real economic opportunity to actually dismantle the cycles of trauma that drive the demand for violent acts in the first place?
Absolutely hear your call for deep systemic reform. And honestly, I share the frustration over the chronic lack of investment in our communities. But let's also address the material's description of the mass shooter profile. It says these are often very disturbed people, explicitly not insane in a clinical sense, but people who feel intensely socially isolated, frustrated, and hopeless, believing they can't resolve their problems. And the author notes this reflects a major problem in our society that people exclude other people.
Yes, exclusion is key.
Exactly. So this profile, it speaks to a spiritual and cultural failure that feels even deeper than economics, perhaps. It's about social inclusion, or the lack thereof, community breakdown, the failure of people to simply see and support their neighbors. The shooter's desire often is to make a big statement, right? To grab attention in the most destructive way imaginable. That motivation seems driven primarily by that exclusion and desperation, not necessarily by the specific tool they choose, even if the tool enables the scale. If the core problem is exclusion, which feels fundamentally cultural or even spiritual, then focusing purely on the instrument only addresses maybe the volume of the resulting tragedy, not the source of the despair itself.
I agree completely that exclusion is a core cultural sickness. No argument there. But that spiritual sickness, that isolation and hopelessness, it's made catastrophically dangerous by the specific tools we allow to proliferate so freely in our society. While exclusion might be the spark and hopelessness the fuel, the choice of a high-powered firearm is precisely what transforms personal despair into mass casualty events. We're talking about the difference between, yes, a terrible tragic murder and a national trauma that scars hundreds, thousands of people. The material even notes that when expert gunmen try to intervene against an active shooter, it often yields more tragic results for the experienced person and for others. Now, that observation is critical, I think. It underlines the dubious value of relying on widespread good guys with guns for self-protection, and it confirms the unique intrinsic lethality of these specific weapons in dynamic, chaotic, real-world situations. The culture of violence, and frankly the culture of indifference to poverty and trauma, they might be two sides of the same coin of societal sickness. While exclusion might be the spark, but the only path I see to immediately mitigate the most catastrophic outcome, the sheer body count, is to focus maybe uncomfortably on the gun. We have to control the instrument, even while we embark on the, yes, painful, likely decades-long work of trying to heal the culture.
Outcomes and the successful examples internationally, I still maintain that immediate action to control the lethal prevalence of firearms is the necessary first step. It directly targets the instrument that has tragically become the biggest killer of our children, and it offers a clear, data-driven path to saving lives right now, today.
And I have to insist that until we as a society demonstrate the genuine moral and political will to resolve those underlying interconnected issues, the poverty, the trauma, the lack of opportunity that create the conditions for crime in the first place, we are essentially just managing symptoms. It feels like applying a tourniquet to a deep systemic infection. Only by seriously addressing the primary causes of crime can we hope to achieve a truly lasting peace, rather than just perhaps a temporary reduction in the frequency of large-scale mass casualty events. It's clear, though, that both perspectives agree on something fundamental. The current, tragic state of gun violence reflects profound failure within our society, maybe even in its spiritual condition, as the material puts it. And that failure shows itself perhaps both in our willingness to tolerate this level of lethal gun prevalence and in our profound indifference often to the root causes of crime and poverty. Indeed, and the critical question hanging over all of this remains whether the U.S. truly has the will to resolve these problems, either the gun problem or the cultural one, or ideally both. This debate, I hope, illuminates the sheer complexity of that task. It really requires listeners to weigh whether the path to making things better starts with addressing the instrument of violence itself or the underlying conditions that give rise to the person who picks it up. Both tasks are monumental, clearly, but where we place our priority determines whose lives we might save today and what kind of peace we might hope to build for tomorrow.